6-year-old Naomi is about to blow out her birthday candle at a humble eatery. This joy is violently extinguished when her mother's abusive ex-fiancé, Chris Owen, slams his hand onto the table. He publicly humiliates Jasmine, mocking her life as a cleaner and her past trauma. The tension reaches a breaking point when Chris grabs Jasmine by the throat, declaring his ownership over her and revealing his identity to Naomi just to cause pain. As the restaurant frozen in fear, Min-ho Kim, a powerful Korean billionaire with rumored Mafia ties, took off his blazer and stepped in. Hello family, welcome to Afro Soul Mafia Stories. Before we proceed with the story, I will like to know where you are watching from. Kindly drop it in the comments section, also like and subscribe to this channel. Thank you. Now let's listen to Jasmine's story. The fluorescent lights of the high school cafeteria always seem to hum with a restless, predatory energy, but 10 years ago, I was too blinded by the light in Chris Owen's eyes to hear the warning. Back then, I wasn't the woman who knew the weight of a mop or the sting of a stranger's hand around my throat. I was just Jasmine, the girl who sat in the back of the library, the one who believed that if you were kind enough to the world, it would eventually be kind back to you. I remember the day Chris first approached me. I was sitting at a corner table, nursing a lukewarm juice box and trying to finish my pre-calculus homework. He was the golden boy of the varsity team, a senior with a smile that felt like an invitation to a world I didn't think I belonged in. When he slid into the plastic chair opposite me, the entire cafeteria seemed to go silent. I waited for the joke, for the prank, but it never came. Instead, he leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, intimate velvet that made my skin prickle. "You're too quiet, Jasmine," he had whispered, reaching out to tuck a stray curl behind my ear. "A girl like you shouldn't be hiding back here. You should be seen." For a month, he made sure I was seen. He brought me flowers before third period, walked me to my bus, and looked at me with an intensity that I mistook for devotion. I was the quiet girl, the one the boys usually ignored, and Chris was the first person to make me feel like I wasn't invisible. When he told me he loved me under the bleachers during a rainy Friday night game, I believed him with every fiber of my being. I thought I had found my protector, the person who would stand between me and the harshness of the world. But the world has a way of shattering your illusions when you least expect it. 3 months into our relationship, the sickness hit me. It was a dizzying morning after morning nausea that I tried to hide, but the truth was growing inside me. When I finally found the courage to tell him, trembling in the hallway between classes, Chris didn't pull me into his arms. He didn't promise we would figure it out. He just looked at me with a cold, detached curiosity, as if I were a science experiment that had finally reached its conclusion. "Is that right?" he asked, a slow, predatory smirk spreading across his face. "Well, I guess the game is over." I didn't understand what he meant until the following Monday. I walked into the cafeteria, my stomach churning with a mix of morning sickness and a growing sense of dread. As I passed the senior table, I heard the laughter. It wasn't the usual teenage boisterousness. It was sharp, jagged, and directed entirely at me. Chris was standing in the center of a circle of his teammates, holding a crumpled wad of cash in his hand. One of his friends, a boy named Marcus, was slapping him on the back, counting out $10 bills. $50, just like we said," Marcus shouted, his voice echoing off the linoleum walls. "The quiet girl was easier than you thought, wasn't she, Chris?" The room went deathly still as I stopped in my tracks. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a frozen lake and the ice had just given way. My eyes locked onto Chris's, pleading for him to tell me it wasn't true, to tell me that the last few months weren't a lie. But Chris didn't look away in shame. He held up the $50 and gave me a mocking salute. "She really thought I liked her," Chris told the crowd, his voice booming with a cruel, performative authority. "She actually thought a guy like me would want a girl like her for anything more than a prank. Thanks for the payout, Jasmine. You were worth every penny." The humiliation was a physical blow. It started in my chest and radiated outward until my hands were shaking so hard I dropped my books. The sound of them hitting the floor was like a gavel coming down on my future. I looked around the room and saw a sea of faces, some laughing, some looking away in pity, but no one stepping forward. I was the joke of the year, the girl who had traded her dignity for a lie. I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I just turned and ran. I ran past the lockers, past the classrooms where I had dreamt of a different life, and out into the cold parking lot. I didn't stop until I reached the bus stop, the tears finally blurring my vision so much I could barely see the road. That was the day I stopped being a student. The school became a haunted house I couldn't bear to enter again. The whispers followed me even when I stayed home, the social media posts blooming like rot until I deleted everything. My parents, already struggling, couldn't look at me without seeing the disappointment of a life cut short. I dropped out that week, trading my graduation cap for a mop and a bucket. The girl who loved pre-calculus was gone, buried under the weight of a $50 bet. As I sat in my small, dark bedroom, clutching my stomach and listening to the rain against the window, I made a promise to the life growing inside me. I told Naomi, even before she had a name, that I would never let anyone make her a bet. I would work until my hands bled to make sure she never felt the coldness of a room full of people laughing at her pain. I thought that was the end of the story, that I would live in the shadows forever, paying for my mistake with every floor I scrubbed. I didn't know that 10 years later, in a restaurant filled with the same kind of silence, a man would stand up and show me that some debts are paid in blood, and some women are worth far more than a $50 wager. I didn't know that Min-Ho Kim was watching, and that he was about to turn Chris Owen's world into the same kind of nightmare he had gifted me all those years ago. The transition from being a girl with dreams to a woman with a mission happened in the cold, gray hours of 4 a.m. After I dropped out, the world I once knew shrank until it was the size of a plastic bucket and an industrial-strength mop. My pregnancy wasn't a time of nursery shopping or baby showers. It was a grueling marathon of physical endurance. By the time I was 7 months along, my back was a constant, throbbing ache, and my ankles swelled until they spilled over the edges of my cheap sneakers, but I couldn't afford to stop. I had moved into a depleted building on the edge of the city, a place where the elevator rarely worked and the hallways smelled of damp concrete and broken promises. It was all I could manage on a cleaner's wage, but every night I would lock my door and rest my hands on my protruding belly, whispering to Naomi that we wouldn't be here forever. I took every shift I could find. I scrubbed the toilets of office buildings where women my age were starting their careers, and I mopped the floors of department stores where I couldn't even afford the socks on the mannequins. There is a specific kind of invisibility that comes with wearing a yellow high-visibility vest and holding a broom. People look through you, not at you. They walk over your freshly mopped floors without a glance, leaving muddy footprints that you have to clean up again without a word of complaint. I learned to keep my head down, to let my hair fall over my face, and to find a rhythmic peace in the back-and-forth motion of the scrub brush. It was the only way to drown out the echoes of the laughter from the high school cafeteria. The lowest point came during an overnight shift at a luxury car dealership downtown. I was 8 months pregnant, my center of gravity so off balance that I had to lean against the wall every few minutes just to catch my breath. I was on my hands and knees, scrubbing the grout in the main showroom when the glass doors whistled open. A group of young men stumbled in, smelling of expensive cologne and late-night cocktails, their voices loud and entitled. I didn't look up. I never did. I just focused on the soap suds. "Yo, check it out," one of them laughed, his voice sounding hauntingly familiar. "Looks like someone missed a spot." I froze. I knew that tone. It was the same arrogant cadence that had belonged to the boys who sat at the senior table. I tried to shrink into the shadows of a silver SUV, but it was too late. A pair of polished leather boots stopped inches from my bucket. Jasmine Lewis. I slowly lifted my gaze. Standing there was Marcus, Chris's best friend, the same boy who had counted out the $50 in the cafeteria. He looked prosperous, wearing a jacket that probably cost more than my 6 months of rent. Beside him stood a girl I recognized from the cheerleading squad. For a second, Marcus's face showed a flash of something like surprise, but it was quickly replaced by a cruel, mocking delight. He looked from my swollen stomach to the damp rag in my hand, and then back to his friends. "No way," Marcus snickered, reaching for his phone. "Chris is never going to believe this. He told everyone you probably ended up in some fancy school on a scholarship, but here you are, scrubbing the floors of the cars he's about to buy." The flash of his camera was like a physical strike. I wanted to scream, to throw the bucket at him, to defend the dignity I was trying so hard to keep for my daughter. But I just felt a heavy, crushing shame. I was a cliché to them, the girl who got knocked up and knocked down. I watched as his thumbs flew across the screen, knowing that within seconds, a photo of me at my absolute lowest was being delivered to Chris Owen. I could almost hear the ping of the notification and the roar of laughter that would surely follow in their group chat. "Don't worry, Jasmine," Marcus tossed over his shoulder as they walked toward the back offices. "I'll tell Chris you're working hard for that baby. Maybe he'll send you another $50 for a tip." That night, I walked home in the pouring rain because I had missed the last bus, my body shaking with a mix of exhaustion and fury. When I reached my apartment, the heat had been turned off again. I sat on the floor of the empty kitchen and cried until I felt empty. But as I sat there, Naomi kicked, a sharp, insistent jab against my ribs. It was a reminder. I wasn't just Jasmine anymore, I was a mother. And if the world wanted to see me as a servant, I would be the most formidable servant it had ever seen, until I could build a fortress around my child. After Naomi was born, the struggle changed shape but never lessened. I learned to function on 3 hours of sleep, nursing her in the quiet dark of the early morning before dropping her off at a subsidized daycare that took half my earnings. I gave her everything I didn't have. Her clothes were always clean, even if mine were frayed. Her books were new, even if I read them by the light of a flickering, half-broken lamp. I moved us from that depleted building to a tiny, one-bedroom basement apartment that at least had consistent heat. I worked double shifts, one as a receptionist and one as a night cleaner, just to save enough for a good life. Every time I felt my strength failing, I thought of that photo on Chris's phone. I imagined him showing it to people, using my struggle as a punchline to prove he had won. It fueled me. It made me scrub harder, save faster, and stand taller. By the time Naomi turned 6, I had managed to carve out a sliver of peace. We were surviving. We were safe. I thought I had buried the past under layers of hard work and silence. I thought that by staying in the shadows, Chris would never find us again. I didn't know that the world had a strange way of bringing villains back for a final act. I didn't know that Chris was still watching, waiting for a moment when he could strike not just at me, but at the heart of the life I had built. And I certainly didn't know that while Chris was laughing at photos of me on the floor, a man like Min-ho Kim was moving into my city. A man who didn't find poverty funny, and who saw a woman with a mop not as a victim, but as a warrior who deserved a throne. The years of the mop and the cradle were coming to an end, and the fire that was about to be lit in that eatery would burn away the shame of the last 10 years forever. The smell of maple syrup and fresh coffee, which only moments ago had felt like a hard-earned luxury, now felt like ash in my mouth. My hand was still pressed against my throat, the skin buzzing with a cold, electric terror as Chris stood over our table, his shadow swallowing the light of Naomi's birthday cupcake. 10 years had passed since the high school cafeteria, but the look in his eyes, that mixture of predatory boredom and casual cruelty, hadn't aged a day. "You really thought you could just disappear, Jasmine," Chris sneered, his voice loud enough to make the elderly couple at the next table freeze with their forks halfway to their mouths. "You thought you could take my kid and hide in the gutters." "Please, Chris," I whispered, my voice trembling as I reached out to pull Naomi's chair closer to mine. "It's her birthday, just go." Naomi was staring up at him, her big, expressive eyes filled with a confusion that was rapidly sharpening into fear. She didn't know this man. To her, he was just a loud, mean stranger who had ruined her cake. But Chris wasn't interested in mercy. He was interested in the kill. He leaned down, placing his hands on the table, his face inches from Naomi's innocent, cherubic features. "You like your birthday, kid?" he asked, a jagged, mocking smile twisting his lips. "I bet your mommy didn't tell you who I am. I'm the reason you're even here. I'm your father." The words hit like a physical weight. Naomi's lip began to tremble, and she looked at me, her eyes pleading for a denial I couldn't give. "Mommy," she whimpered, her tiny hand gripping my arm so hard her knuckles turned white. "Don't look at her," Chris barked, slamming his fist on the table so hard the syrup bottle toppled over, bleeding sticky amber across the cloth. "She's been lying to you your whole life. She's nothing but a low-life cleaner who ran away because she couldn't handle the truth. You belong to me." The cruelty of it, telling a 6-year-old girl she was the product of a grudge and a lie on the day she was meant to feel most loved, ignited a spark of heat in my chest that even my fear couldn't quench. I stood up, shielding Naomi with my body. "Don't you dare touch her," I hissed. Chris laughed, a dry, metallic sound. He reached out, his fingers locking around my wrist with a bruising strength. Or what, Jasmine? You going to hit me with a mop? You're still the same pathetic girl from the cafeteria. Nobody is coming to save. Release her. The voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying, resonant weight that seemed to suck the air out of the room. It was the sound of steel sliding against stone. Chris stiffened, his grip on my wrist tightening for a second before he slowly turned his head. At the corner table, the man I had noticed earlier was standing up. Min-ho Kim looked like a sculpture of obsidian and silk. His sharp, chiseled face was an unreadable mask of calm, but his eyes held an intensity that suggested he was looking at something he intended to dismantle. Mind your business, pal, Chris spat, though I could hear the slight tremor of uncertainty beneath his bravado. This is family business. Min-ho didn't respond with words. Instead, he reached up and began to unbutton the front of his dark, tailored blazer. The movement was slow, deliberate, and impossibly dominant. As he shrugged the jacket off and draped it over the back of his chair, the white silk of his dress shirt strained against the muscular, athletic build of his shoulders. But it was his arms that made the restaurant go deathly silent. Tracing up from his wrists and disappearing beneath his rolled-up sleeves were the intricate, dark coils of Ayers-Yumi tattoos, shadowy dragons and waves that spoke of a life lived in a world far more dangerous than the one Chris inhabited. They weren't the tattoos of a hobbyist. They were the markings of a man who commanded shadows. Min-ho stepped out from behind his table. He moved with the grace of a predator, each step silent and purposeful. Chris let go of my wrist, his hands rising instinctively into a defensive posture, but he looked small, clumsy, and unpolished compared to the man walking toward him. You have 30 seconds to leave this establishment, Min-ho said, stopping just a foot away from Chris. He didn't raise his voice, which made it infinitely scarier. If you are still here at 31, you will leave in an ambulance. Choose. You think you're tough because you've got some ink, Chris snarled, trying to reclaim his dominance. He swung a wild, telegraphed punch at Min-ho's face. It was over before I could even gasp. Min-ho didn't flinch. He moved his head a fraction of an inch, letting the fist whistle past his ear, and then his hand shot out like a viper. He caught Chris's throat in a grip that looked like iron, with a single, fluid motion. He drove Chris backward, pinning him against the wall of the booth. Chris's feet dangled inches off the floor, his face turning a frantic, mottled purple as he clawed at Min-ho's tattooed forearm. The strength was effortless. Min-ho leaned in, his expression remains as composed as if he were checking his watch. You speak of bets and lies, Min-ho whispered, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent eatery. But you are the only lie in this room. You are a coward who hides behind the trauma of a woman and the innocence of a child. In my world, we deal with people like you quite permanently. Min-ho shifted his grip, catching Chris by the collar and the belt, and literally threw him toward the exit. Chris hit the floor near the swinging doors, skidding across the linoleum he had just been mocking me for cleaning. He scrambled to his feet, gasping for air, his eyes wide with a primal, gut-wrenching terror. He didn't look back. He pushed through the doors and sprinted into the parking lot, leaving nothing behind but the stench of his own fear. The restaurant remained frozen. Min-ho didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the manager who had stood by and done nothing. He turned toward us. As his eyes landed on Naomi, who was still trembling behind me, the terrifying intensity in his gaze vanished, replaced by a softness so sudden it made my heart ache. He reached back for his blazer, but he didn't put it on. He held it out, draped over his arm, and bowed slightly, a gesture of profound, old-world respect. I apologize for the disturbance, he said, looking directly at me. For the first time, I saw the man behind the boss, a man who looked like he knew exactly what it felt like to lose everything, and exactly what it took to protect what remained. Your daughter's birthday deserves more than the shadow of a ghost. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in 10 years, the crushing weight of the quiet girl from the cafeteria started to lift. I wasn't just a cleaner, and he wasn't just a stranger. As he reached out a hand to help me steady the toppled syrup bottle, I realized that the bet Chris had won all those years ago had just been called in. And the man standing in front of me was about to raise the stakes higher than I ever dreamed possible. The ride away from the eatery was unlike any experience I had ever known. The interior of Minho's car was a sanctuary of silent, charcoal leather and the faint, expensive scent of sandalwood. Outside the tinted windows, the city that had spent 10 years chewing me up and spitting me out blurred into a streak of neon and gray. But inside, the only sound was the soft, rhythmic breathing of Naomi. She had finally fallen asleep against my side, her small hand still clutching the hem of my blouse, her birthday clips slightly askew in her curls. Minho sat in the front seat, his silhouette sharp and unmoving. He had put his blazer back on, but the image of the tattoos winding up his arms remained burned into my mind, a map of a life far more dangerous than the one I had fled. I watched the back of his head, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. I knew how the world worked. Men didn't just step out of the shadows to save women like me for nothing. I kept waiting for the price tag, for the moment he would turn around and demand the interest on the life he had just preserved. We began to climb away from the city center, the streets widening and the buildings growing taller and more imposing. Finally, the car slowed before a pair of massive, wrought-iron gates that looked like they belonged to a fortress. High-resolution cameras pivoted toward us, and a group of stone-faced men in dark suits stepped out from a security kiosk, their eyes scanning the perimeter with a professional, lethal focus. With a low hum of machinery, the gates swung inward, revealing a winding driveway lined with ancient oaks that stood like sentinels in the moonlight. As we crested the hill, the estate came into view. It was a sprawling masterpiece of glass, steel, and dark stone, perched on the edge of a cliff like a king overlooking his domain. The sheer scale of it was suffocating. I looked down at my hands, red and chapped from years of cleaning chemicals, and then back at the architectural marvel before us. I felt like a smudge of dirt on a silk dress. The car came to a smooth halt beneath a grand portico. A driver opened my door, but I didn't move. I stayed huddled in the seat, my arm tightening around Naomi. "Jasmine." Minho's voice was quiet, but it cut through my panic like a warm light. He was standing outside the car, his hand held out toward me. I looked at his palm, then up at his face. The authoritative mask he wore in the restaurant was gone, replaced by an expression of profound, watchful patience. "Where are we?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "Why are we here?" "You are at my home," he said simply. "A place where the doors lock from the inside and the shadows belong to me. You and your daughter are safe here." I stepped out of the car, my legs feeling like lead. As I looked up at the towering glass walls and the soft, golden light spilling from the foyer, a wave of nausea hit me. It was too much. It was too beautiful. It was too far removed from the basement apartment and the depleted building where the walls bled moisture and the rats scurried in the dark. "I can't stay here," I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I don't belong here. I know how this goes, Minho. Chris told me he loved me too. He promised me the world under the bleachers, and then he sold my soul for $50. Is that what this is? Is this just a bigger bet, a more expensive prank?" The silence that followed was heavy. The security guards retreated into the shadows, leaving us alone under the glow of the portico. Minho stepped closer, not in a way that felt threatening, but in a way that forced me to see him. He didn't reach for me. He respected the boundary of my fear. "I do not play games with lives, Jasmine," he said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant frequency. "In my world, a man's word is his only currency. If he breaks it, he loses everything. I did not step into that restaurant to win a wager. I stepped in because I saw a woman who has been fighting a war alone for 10 years, and I decided that the war is over." He gestured toward the house, his eyes never leaving mine. "I know the buildings you have lived in. I know the hallways where you felt invisible. I am telling you now, as a man who has seen the darkest corners of this world, that you will never step foot in a depleted building again. You will never walk down a school hallway as a victim, and you will never have to look over your shoulder to see if a ghost is following you." "Why?" I asked, a single tear escaping and tracing a hot path down my cheek. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," he replied softly. "I saw the way you stood in front of your daughter when a monster was reaching for you. I saw a strength that most men in my organization couldn't hope to possess. You have spent a decade being told you are worth $50. I am here to tell you that you are the only person in this city who isn't for sale." He reached out then, his fingers barely brushing the tears from my face. His touch was electric, but it wasn't the searing heat of Chris's aggression. It was a steady, grounding warmth. Tonight, you sleep in a room where the windows are unbreakable and the bed is soft. Tomorrow, we begin the work of making sure Chris Owen never speaks your name again without trembling. This is not a trick, Jasmine. This is a fortress. And the gates are closed to everyone but you. I looked back at Naomi, who was being gently lifted from the car by a kind-faced woman in a housekeeper's uniform. My daughter didn't wake. She simply tucked her head into the woman's shoulder, safe in a way she had never been in our basement flat. I turned back to Minho, and for the first time in my life, I took the hand of a man without feeling like I was signing a contract for my own destruction. As we walked through the massive front doors, the sound of the locks engaging behind us didn't sound like a prison. It sounded like a promise. The girl from the cafeteria was still there, somewhere deep inside, shivering with a decade of cold, but as the warmth of the mansion enveloped us, I felt the first thaw. I was through the gates, and for the first time, the man holding the key was standing on my side. The sun had not yet crested the horizon when I found myself sitting in the vast, moonlit library of Minho's estate. The air was cool and still, smelling of old paper and the rain-slicked gardens outside. Naomi was asleep upstairs in a room that looked like a palace, guarded by men who moved like ghosts, but I couldn't rest. The ghosts of my own past were too loud. Minho sat across from me in a deep leather armchair, his blazer discarded, his white sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark, intricate ink that marked his skin. He didn't push me to speak. He simply waited, his presence a heavy, grounding anchor in the room. Finally, the words began to spill out. I told him everything, the way the high school cafeteria used to smell like floor wax and cheap burgers, and how Chris had looked at me as if I were the only girl in the world. I told him about the $50 bet, the laughter that sounded like breaking glass, and the way the principal had looked at me with pity instead of justice when I dropped out. As I spoke, I watched Minho's face. He didn't look shocked, and he didn't look sorry for me. Instead, a terrifying, predatory stillness settled over him. His jaw tightened until the bone looked like it might snap, and his eyes, usually so composed, turned into shards of black ice. He didn't interrupt until I reached the moment at the dealership, when Marcus took the photo of me on my knees with a mop. Minho's hand, resting on the mahogany armrest, gripped the wood so hard I heard a faint, splintering groan. He didn't raise his voice, but the vibration of his anger felt like a low-frequency hum in the floorboards. "They turned your life into a game," he said, his voice a dangerous velvet. "They treated your dignity as a commodity to be traded among cowards. They took a woman who was a queen and tried to convince her she was a servant." I looked down at my chapped hands, the shame of 10 years still stinging like an open wound. "I just wanted to survive for Naomi," I whispered. "I thought if I stayed small enough, they couldn't hurt us again. I thought I earned my place on the floor." "You earned nothing but the right to see them fall," Minho replied. He stood up, his tall silhouette blocking out the light from the fireplace. "Go back to sleep, Jasmine. Tomorrow, the world changes. I told you that you would never be a victim again. I intend to make that a legal reality." I woke the next morning to the smell of fresh jasmine tea and the sight of a new outfit laid out on the silk duvet, a tailored blazer and trousers that fit me like armor. After a quiet breakfast with a happy, oblivious Naomi, Minho led me back to the car. We didn't drive to a lawyer's office or a police station. We drove back to the very eatery where Chris had grabbed my throat just 24 hours earlier. When we pulled up, the parking lot was empty except for a line of black SUVs. The open sign was turned to closed, but the lights inside were blazing. As we stepped through the doors, the silence was deafening. The staff were lined up behind the counter, looking pale and terrified. In the center of the room stood the manager, the man who had stood by and watched Chris humiliate me, the man who hadn't even called the police while my daughter screamed. Minho didn't look at the staff. He walked straight to the center of the room, pulling a fountain pen and a leather folder from his pocket. He turned to the manager, his expression one of cold, absolute authority. "I spent the morning speaking with the corporate board of this franchise," Minho said, his voice echoing off the tile walls. "I found it interesting that they were willing to sell the entire building, the land, and the licensing for a very specific price, Once I explained the liability of a manager who allows violent assaults on his premises without intervention. The manager stammered, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "Sir, I didn't want to get involved in a domestic." "You didn't want to get involved," Minho cut him off, his eyes flashing with a lethal light. "You watched a man strangle a woman in front of a child, and you worried about the mess on your floor. You are a bystander to evil, which makes you a participant. You are fired. Pack your things and leave. If I ever see your face in this zip code again, we will have a very different conversation." As the manager scrambled toward the back office, Minho turned to me. The staff watched us with wide, trembling eyes, the same people who had whispered about my cleaner clothes just a day ago. Minho opened the leather folder and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He laid them on the very table where Naomi's birthday cupcake had been crushed. "This building no longer belongs to a corporation that doesn't know your name," Minho said. He handed me the fountain pen. "Sign here, Jasmine." "Minho, I don't understand," I stammered, my heart racing. "What is this?" "This is the deed," he said simply. "This restaurant, the land it sits on, and every person employed here now belongs to you. You were mocked here for being a servant. From this moment on, you are the boss. You decide who stays, who goes, and who is allowed through these doors. You will never have to count coins for a tip again because you own the house." I looked at the papers, my vision blurring with hot, sudden tears. The weight of the pen felt like a mountain in my hand. I looked at the table, then at the staff, and then at Minho. He wasn't looking at me with the pity I had received in high school. He was looking at me with a profound, unwavering respect, the look of a man who had recognized a fellow warrior and was giving her the fortress she deserved. I signed my name. Each stroke of the pen felt like a link of a chain snapping. When I finished, Minho took the folder and handed me a set of keys. "The next time Chris Owen thinks about coming here," Minho whispered, leaning close so only I could hear, "he won't be entering a public space. He will be trespassing on your property, and I have already ensured that my security detail will be the ones responding to the alarm." I walked to the front door and flipped the sign from closed to open. But this time, I wasn't the woman waiting for a table or hopping for a job. I was Jasmine Lewis, owner and survivor. As I looked out at the street, I realized that Minho hadn't just bought me a business. He had bought back the 10 years Chris had stolen. The $50 bet was finally, officially, bankrupt. And for the first time in a decade, I wasn't afraid to breathe. The victory at the eatery had provided a sense of peace, but I knew it was the kind of peace that existed in the eye of a hurricane. While I spent my days learning the intricacies of running my new business, a cold dread remained rooted in the pit of my stomach. I knew Chris Owen. He was a man who measured his worth by the things he could break, and Minho Kim had broken his pride in front of a stadium of witnesses. I knew he wouldn't stay away. I just didn't expect him to strike at the one place I thought was sacred. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of mundane, sun-drenched day that lulls you into a false sense of security. I was at the restaurant reviewing inventory when my phone buzzed with an urgent notification from Naomi's school security app. Someone was trying to check her out early, someone who wasn't on the approved pickup list. My heart didn't just drop, it stopped. I didn't even grab my purse. I ran for the door, but before I could reach the sidewalk, a black sedan was already idling at the curb. Minho was in the back seat, his expression a mask of lethal focus. He didn't say a word. He just opened the door, and the moment I slid inside, the car surged forward. By the time we pulled into the school's circular drive, the scene was already beginning to draw a crowd of concerned parents and teachers. Chris was standing near the front gates, looking disheveled and frantic. He was shouting at a trembling young teacher, waving a crumpled piece of paper, likely the old, contested birth certificate, and demanding they bring his daughter to him. Naomi was standing a few yards back, clutching her backpack to her chest, her face a pale mask of terror. She had seen the way he treated me. To her, he wasn't a father. He was the monster from her nightmares come to life in the daylight. "I have rights," Chris bellowed, his voice cracking with a desperate, pathetic need for control. "I'm her blood. You can't keep a man from his own flesh and blood." The car hadn't even fully stopped before Minho was out. This time, he wasn't alone. 3 other black SUVs pulled in behind us, forming a silent, impenetrable wall of steel between Chris and the school entrance. A dozen men in dark suits stepped out in perfect unison, their presence turning the schoolyard into a fortress. Chris spun around, his eyes widening as he saw Minho approaching. He tried to puff out his chest, tried to find that old high school bravado, but it withered under Minho's gaze. Minho didn't stop until he was inches away from Chris, his tall, athletic frame casting a long shadow over the smaller man. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't even raise his hands. He simply stood there, an immovable mountain of cold authority. "You have mistaken your biology for a privilege," Minho said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that silenced the crowd. "A father is not the man who wins a bet. A father is the man who stays to build the world his child dreams of. You did not stay. You ran, and you will not take another step toward her." "You can't do this," Chris shrieked, looking around for someone to support him, but the onlookers were moving away, repelled by his toxic energy. "I'm her dad." Minho leaned in, his voice dropping so low it was almost a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a death sentence. "If you ever mention your name and hers in the same breath again, I will ensure that the legal system is the least of your worries. My men are now stationed at every exit. You are trespassing on a peace you do not deserve. Leave, now." As the security detail stepped forward, Chris realized the game was truly over. He scrambled back toward his rusted car, his dignity not just gone, but incinerated. He fled like a shadow being chased by the sun. But the true shift didn't happen when Chris left. It happened when Minho turned his back on the retreating coward and looked at Naomi. I watched from the sidelines, my breath caught in my throat. I expected him to remain the stoic boss, the protector who worked from the shadows. Instead, Minho did something I had never seen a man do. He knelt. He got down on his knees in the dirt of the schoolyard, bringing himself eye level with my terrified daughter. He didn't reach out to grab her. He waited for her to come to him. He held out his hand, palm up, in a gesture of absolute vulnerability. The tattoos on his wrists were visible, but they didn't look like symbols of violence anymore. They looked like a shield. "Naomi," he said, and his voice was so gentle it made my eyes sting. "The bad man is gone. He will never come back to your school or your home or your dreams. I have given my word." Naomi took a small, trembling step forward. She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the man who had taken the blazer off to save her mother, the man who had given her a palace to sleep in, and the man who now stood in the dirt just to make sure she felt tall. "Are you going to stay?" she whispered, her voice tiny and hopeful. Minho's expression softened into a smile that was so genuine, so full of an unexpected warmth, that it transformed his sharp features. "As long as you want me to be there, I will be the wall that nothing can cross." Naomi didn't hesitate then. She ran into his arms, burying her face in his shoulder. Minho gathered her up, holding her with a careful, reverent strength, as if he were carrying something far more precious than his entire empire. He stood up, and for the first time, Naomi didn't look like a girl living in the shadow of a trauma. She looked like a girl who knew she was loved. As they walked toward me, Naomi looked over Minho's shoulder, her eyes bright with a new kind of certainty. "Mommy," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Minho is the real dad, right? The one who actually protects us." I looked at the man holding my daughter, the man who had traded his blazer for a battle and his coldness for a child's trust. I looked at the way he held her, as if he had finally found the family he had lost in the darkness of his own past. "Yes, baby," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "He's the real one." In that moment, the $50 bet was finally buried. Chris Owen might have provided the biology, but Minho Kim had provided the soul. As we drove away from the school, Naomi's laughter filled the car, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't looking back to see if someone was following. She was looking forward, and so was I. The Mafia boss had won a daughter's heart, and in doing so, he had become the father Chris never had the courage to be. The legal system, I quickly learned, was a slow-moving beast, but Minho's world operated with the speed of a falling guillotine. Following the confrontation at Naomi's school, a heavy silence had descended over our lives, a silence I knew was pregnant with Chris's desperation. He was a cornered animal now, stripped of his bravado and his access to the daughter he never truly wanted. When the envelope arrived at the restaurant on a rainy Thursday morning, I knew before I even opened it that the ghost was trying one last haunting. Inside were grainy, printed screenshots of the photos Marcus had taken at the car dealership years ago. Me, on my knees, mid-sob, clutching a mop bucket while 8 months pregnant. Attached was a handwritten note, the ink jagged and frantic. "Give me $50,000 by tomorrow, or these go to every parent at that fancy school. Let's see how much the Mafia boss likes a woman who spent her life scrubbing floors. You're still just a cleaner, Jasmine. Pay up, or everyone finds out." My hands shook so violently the paper rattled like dry leaves. The old shame, the cafeteria shame, surged back hot and suffocating. I felt the urge to hide, to apologize for my existence, to pay him just to make the mockery stop. I was still staring at the photos when the door to my office opened. Minho stepped in, his presence immediately cooling the air. He didn't need to ask. He saw the paper in my hand and the hollow look in my eyes. He took the note from me, his sharp features remaining eerily calm as he read it. He didn't erupt in a shout. He didn't pace. He simply folded the paper and tucked it into his breast pocket. The stillness that came over him was more terrifying than any outburst. It was the silence of a predator who had just located its prey's throat. "He thinks he can use your struggle as a weapon," Minho said, his voice a low, resonant baritone. "He thinks the fact that you survived, that you worked until your hands bled for your child, is a source of shame. He is about to learn that in my world there is no greater sin than threatening what belongs to me." "Minho, the school, the parents, if they see those," I whispered, my voice breaking. "They will see a warrior," Minho replied, leaning down to catch my gaze. "But they will never see those photos. Chris Owen believes he is playing a game of leverage. He does not realize that I own the lever, the ground he stands on, and the air he is currently breathing." Minho didn't call a lawyer. He didn't file for a restraining order that Chris would only ignore. Instead, he made a single, quiet phone call in a language I didn't understand. The war began at noon. Chris Owen worked as a mid-level sales manager at a logistics firm, a job he kept only through a thin veil of competence and a loud mouth. By 1:00 p.m., an anonymous tip, backed by a digital trail of untraceable evidence, reached his CEO. It detailed years of embezzled expense reports and a history of workplace harassment that had been buried by intimidation. By 1:30 p.m., Chris was escorted out of the building by security, his personal items dumped into a cardboard box in the rain. But Minho wasn't finished. In the dark, interconnected web of the city's power, a mafia boss doesn't just take your job, he deletes your life. By 3:00 p.m., the landlord of Chris's luxury apartment, a man who owed Minho a favor that spanned 3 generations, notified Chris that his lease had been terminated due to a morality clause violation found in the fine print. His locks were changed before he even reached the curb. By sunset, Chris's bank accounts were flagged for suspicious activity, freezing every cent of the money he thought would protect him. He was a man who had built his entire identity on looking down at others, and within 6 hours, he had no floor left to stand on. I was at the estate that evening when the final report came in. Minho was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the library, staring out at the city lights. One of his associates, a man named Jun with a shadow-like demeanor, entered and bowed deeply. "It is done, boss," Jun said. He attempted to check into a hotel. His cards were declined. He is currently sitting in his car in a parking lot. We have the original digital files and the phone. There are no copies. Jun handed a small, silver thumb drive to Minho. Minho turned to me, holding it out. "The only record of your pain is now in your hands, Jasmine. You can destroy it, or you can keep it as a reminder of how far you've climbed. But no one else will ever see it." I took the drive, the weight of it feeling like the final stone being removed from my chest. "What happens to him now?" I asked. Minho stepped closer, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a tenderness that defied the ruthlessness he had just unleashed. "He will learn what it feels like to be invisible. He will learn what it feels like to have the world walk past you while you sit on the cold ground. He wanted to shame you for being a cleaner. Now he will find out that he isn't even fit to wash the floors you walk on." I realized then that Minho hadn't used a single legal document. He had used the shadows. He had dismantled a man's existence without ever leaving his home. It was a terrifying display of power, but as I looked into Minho's eyes, I didn't feel afraid. For 10 years, the law had been a suggestion that Chris Owen ignored. Minho's will, however, was a law that could not be broken. "The blackmail is over, Jasmine," Minho whispered. "He has nothing left to threaten you with. He is a ghost now, wandering a city that no longer recognizes him." I looked at the thumb drive and then at the fireplace. I walked over and tossed the drive into the heart of the flames. I watched the plastic melt and the digital ghost of my shame turn into ash. I wasn't just a cleaner. I wasn't just a single mom. I was a woman who was loved by a man who would burn the world down just to keep her name clean. The legal war was won, but the true victory was the silence that followed, a silence that finally belonged to me. The following weeks were a blur of quiet healing and strange, beautiful stability. The restaurant was thriving under my new management, and for the first time in a decade, I wasn't waking up to the sound of an alarm clock that felt like a threat. But as the external storm settled, an internal one began to brew. I still felt like a guest in Minho's life, a charity case he had scooped up from the floor of an eatery. I was waiting for the moment he would realize I was just a girl who had been broken by a $50 bet, and that the queen he saw was just a facade built from his own generosity. One evening, after Naomi had been tucked into her silk sheets, Minho invited me to the rooftop terrace. The city stretched out below us, a carpet of shimmering lights that seemed small and manageable from this height. Minho was standing by the glass railing, his blazer off, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the tattoos that I now knew were symbols of loyalty, not just violence. He looked out at the horizon with a heavy, contemplative silence. "You've been quiet today, Jasmine," he said, not turning around, yet perfectly aware of my presence. "Your mind is back in the basement apartment. Why?" I stepped up beside him, the cool night air biting at my skin. "I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop, Minho. I look at this house, I look at the restaurant you gave me, and I feel like I'm living someone else's life. I'm just a woman you rescued. I don't know how to be the person who belongs here." Minho turned then, his sharp features softened by the amber glow of the terrace lights. "You think this is a rescue mission? You think I brought you here because I felt sorry for you?" "Didn't you?" I asked, my voice a mere whisper. "I was being strangled in public. You saved me." Minho stepped closer, his shadow falling over me, grounding me. "I saved you from a physical hand, yes, but I did not bring you into my home out of pity. I brought you here because I recognized something in you that I haven't seen in years, something I lost." He looked away for a moment, his gaze turning inward, toward a darkness I hadn't yet fully understood. 12 years ago, I wasn't the man you see now. I was younger, arrogant, and I thought my wealth could protect anything. I had a wife and a daughter. Their names were Hannah and Sarah. The air in my lungs seemed to catch. I had suspected he carried a ghost, but hearing their names made the grief tangible. "They were taken by people who wanted to send me a message," Minho continued, his voice dropping to a low, jagged rasp. "People like Chris Owen, but with more power and less conscience. They thought they could break me by breaking them, and for a long time they were right. I spent years in a cold, hollow shell of a life, believing that strength was only about how much pain you could inflict on others." He turned back to me, his eyes searching mine with a desperate, raw honesty. "When I saw you in that restaurant, Jasmine, I didn't see a victim. I saw a woman who had been hit by every wave the world could throw at her for 10 years, poverty, mockery, betrayal, and loneliness. And yet you were still standing. You were still fighting for your child. You didn't become bitter, you became a fortress. I saw a strength in you that survived a decade of silence, while mine was nearly destroyed in a single night." He reached out, his hand cupping my face with a reverence that made my heart ache. "I am not offering you a place in my life because you need saving. I am offering it because I need your strength. I have spent my life surrounding myself with men who follow orders, but I have never met someone who survived the world with nothing but her own 2 hands and a mother's love. That is not a cleaner, Jasmine. That is a queen." Minho reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. He didn't drop to one knee. He stood tall, looking at me as an equal, a fellow soldier who had survived a different kind of war. "I don't want to be your savior," he said, opening the box to reveal a ring that held a diamond as clear and deep as a mountain spring. "I want to be your partner. I want to build an empire where Naomi never has to wonder if she is a bet, and where you never have to wonder if you are enough. I'm asking you to be my wife, to lead this family and this organization by my side. Not because I rescued you, but because you proved that you were already royalty long before I ever took my blazer off." The tears finally broke, but they weren't the hot, stinging tears of the cafeteria or the car dealership. They were a cleansing rain. In Minho's eyes, I didn't see the girl who dropped out of school. I saw the woman who had nursed a child in a cold room and worked until the sun came up. He wasn't looking at my past, he was looking at my spirit. "I spent 10 years thinking I was a mistake," I sobbed, my forehead resting against his chest. "The only mistake was the world's failure to recognize you," Minho whispered into my hair. "Let me spend the rest of my life making sure they never make that mistake again." I looked at the ring, then at the man who had seen my scars and called them beautiful. I realized then that the Queen's proposal wasn't about the diamond or the mansion. It was about the fact that for the first time in my life, a man was looking at me and seeing the truth. I wasn't being saved, I was being found. "Yes," I breathed, the word a vow that echoed across the quiet terrace. "Yes, Minho." As he slid the ring onto my finger, the last of the quiet girl from the library finally vanished. The Mafia boss had found his match, and I had found my throne. The bet was over, and the real life was finally, officially, beginning. The transformation of the city's social hierarchy was completed not with a whisper, but with the roar of 1,000 camera flashes. The wedding of Minho Kim and Jasmine Lewis was heralded by the media as the event of the century, a collision of old-world mystery and a modern-day fairy tale. For me, however, it was something far more profound. It was the final, formal burial of a girl who had once been defined by a $50 wager and the smell of industrial bleach. The venue was a cathedral of glass and white roses, perched high above the city where I had once scrubbed the very sidewalks. As I stood in the dressing room, the heavy silk of my gown felt less like a garment and more like a suit of armor. It was a custom masterpiece, encrusted with thousands of hand-stitched crystals that caught the light like fallen stars. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror, and for the first time, I didn't see the exhaustion in my eyes or the tension in my shoulders. I saw a woman who had walked through fire and come out forged in gold. "Mommy, you look like a real queen," Naomi whispered from behind me. She was dressed in a miniature version of my gown, her dark curls adorned with a diamond tiara that Minho had gifted her that morning. She wasn't the terrified girl from the eatery anymore. She was a child who knew, with every fiber of her being, that she was cherished. "We both are, baby," I said, squeezing her hand. "And today the whole world is going to see it." Outside the heavy oak doors, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and the hushed, anxious energy of 1,000 high-profile guests. Minho had ensured that the guest list was a calculated strike of poetic justice. Sitting in the front rows were the elite of the city, but scattered among them were the ghosts of my past. I had seen the list. There were people I hadn't seen since the day I dropped out of high school. The cheerleaders who had whispered in the hallways, the boys who had laughed at Chris's jokes, and even some of the former school staff who had looked through me as if I were a stain on the floor. They were all there, dressed in their finest, desperate for a glimpse of the woman who had captured the heart of the most powerful man in the country. They were the same people who would have crossed the street to avoid me a year ago, now fighting for the prestige of an invitation to my table. The cleaner, they had mocked, was now the gatekeeper of the life they all craved. The music shifted, a soaring orchestral arrangement that vibrated in my chest. The doors swung open, and the world fell silent. I stepped onto the white runner, my head held higher than it had ever been. As I began the long walk down the aisle, I didn't look at the cameras or the televised crews lining the back of the hall. I looked at the faces in the pews. I saw Marcus, Chris's old best friend, sitting 3 rows back. He looked pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and genuine terror as he realized the woman he had photographed on her knees was now the woman who held his future in her hands. I saw the girls who had started the rumors, their mouths agape as they took in the sheer, undeniable elegance of the quiet girl. They thought they had broken. I didn't glare at them. I didn't need to. The silence of the room was my vindication. Every step I took on that white silk was a step away from the basement apartment, the double shifts, and the shame. I wasn't erasing my past. I was transcending it. I wanted them to see every diamond, every inch of lace, and every ounce of my confidence. I wanted them to know that while they were busy playing games with lives, I had been building a soul they couldn't touch. And then there was Minho. He was waiting for me at the altar, dressed in a black tuxedo that made his sharp features look like they were carved from midnight. He wasn't wearing his blazer draped over his arm today. He was standing in the full power of his position. But as our eyes met, the Mafia boss vanished. The man who looked back at me was the one who had knelt in the dirt for my daughter, the one who had burned a thumb drive of my pain, and the one who saw me as his equal. His smile was small, private, and filled with a fierce pride that brought tears to my eyes. When I finally reached him, he didn't wait for the priest to speak. He reached out and took my hands, his thumbs tracing the line of my knuckles with a steadying warmth. "You took my breath away in an eatery," he whispered, loud enough only for me to hear. "But today, you've taken the world." The ceremony was a blur of sacred vows and the weight of a gold band being slid onto my finger. When the priest finally pronounced us husband and wife, Minho didn't just kiss me. He held me as if he were anchoring us both to the earth. As we turned to face the crowd, now officially the Kim family, the applause was deafening. It was the sound of 1,000 people acknowledging a new era. I looked out at the sea of faces, at the people who had once treated my life like a $50 bet, and I realized they no longer had any power over me. Their mockery had been the fuel, their cruelty the forge, but the result was mine. We walked back down the aisle, Naomi skipping between us, her hands linked in ours. As we passed the row where Marcus sat, I didn't turn away. I looked him directly in the eye and gave a small, regal nod. It wasn't a gesture of forgiveness, but of finality. The cleaner label was gone, incinerated by the light of the glass cathedral and the strength of the man at my side. I was Jasmine Lewis Kim, a woman who had traded a mop for a scepter and a basement for a throne. The high school bet had ended a decade ago, but today, the real payout had finally been delivered. And as the doors closed behind us, shutting out the world of the past, I knew that the girl who had once dropped out in tears would never have to cry again. The queen had arrived, and the world was finally at her feet. The years that followed the wedding were not merely a transition. They were a total displacement of the reality I had once known. The basement apartments and the scent of industrial cleaner were now nothing more than ghosts, distant and fading memories that I kept tucked away like old, yellowed photographs. I had become a woman who moved through the world with the quiet, unshakable confidence of someone who finally knew her worth. As the wife of Minho Kim, I oversaw foundations that rebuilt the very depleted buildings I had once lived in, turning shadows of despair into homes of hope. Naomi had grown into a brilliant, spirited young woman who spoke 3 languages and walked with the grace of her father, the man who had chosen her, not the one who had abandoned her. Life had become a tapestry of light, but justice, I realized, is a dish best served with the cold clarity of time. It was a brisk Tuesday evening in late autumn. I was leaving the city's Grand Library after hosting a gala for my literacy foundation. The air was sharp with the coming winter, and the sidewalk was a mosaic of fallen leaves and city lights. I was dressed in a floor-length coat of midnight cashmere, my hand resting on Minho's arm as we walked toward the waiting motorcade. The security detail moved in a silent, professional perimeter around us, their eyes scanning the shadows I no longer feared. As we approached the corner where our SUV was idling, I noticed a figure huddled against the cold stone of an alleyway. In a city of millions, the sight of the unhoused was a constant, tragic reality, but this man caught my eye for a reason I couldn't immediately name. He was wrapped in a tattered, stained blanket that had long ago lost its color. His hair was a matted nest of graying brown, and his skin was mapped with the grime of 1,000 nights spent on the concrete. He held a rusted tin cup in hands that shook with a primal, rhythmic tremor, not just from the cold, but from a life that had been hollowed out. I stopped. Minho felt the shift in my posture and paused, his gaze following mine. He didn't speak. He simply waited, his presence a silent wall of protection. As I stepped closer, the man lifted his head, hopping for a sympathetic glance from the wealthy woman in the fine coat. When our eyes met, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. It was Chris. The strong jawline was gone, hidden behind a scraggly, unkempt beard. The athletic build had withered into a skeletal frame, and the eyes, those once arrogant, predatory eyes that had mocked my pregnancy and laughed at my mop bucket, were now nothing but empty craters of desperation. He didn't recognize me at first. To him, I was just another anonymous donor, another queen in a city that had long ago forgotten his name. "Please," he rasped, his voice a broken shell of the one that had once shouted insults in a crowded eatery. "A few cents. Anything. I haven't eaten in 2 days." I looked down at him, and for a heartbeat, the old Jasmine, the girl from the cafeteria, wanted to feel pity. But then I remembered the way Naomi had screamed when he grabbed my throat. I remembered the $50 bet. I remembered the years he spent laughing while I scrubbed floors to keep my daughter alive. "Do you know who I am, Chris?" I asked, my voice calm and clear as a bell in the winter air. He squinted, the fog of hunger and hardship clouding his mind. Then, slowly, his eyes traveled from my face to the diamond wedding band on my finger, and finally to the man standing behind me, the man who had once taken off his blazer to dismantle Chris's entire world. A flash of pure, unadulterated terror crossed his face. He began to tremble so violently the tin cup rattled against the pavement. "Jasmine," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Jasmine, please, I didn't know. I didn't mean. Look at me. I have nothing." "You have exactly what you earned," I said. I reached into my silk-lined pocket and pulled out my purse. I didn't reach for a $100 bill or a wad of cash. I searched until my fingers found a single, solitary coin, a 50-cent piece. I leaned down, the scent of my expensive perfume clashing with the stench of his decay. I dropped the coin into his cup. The clink of the metal against the tin sounded like a final gavel. "What is this?" he whimpered, looking at the small coin as if it were a joke. "It's the payout, Chris," I told him, my voice devoid of anger, filled only with a cold, final truth. "It's the exact amount of the bet you made on my life in high school, adjusted for the man you've become." He looked at the coin, then back at me, his eyes filling with a pathetic, watery regret. "Jasmine, please. I'm starving. I'm dying out here." "Keep the change," I said, turning away from him and stepping toward the car. "You already sold your soul for it 10 years ago. It's only fair you finally get to spend it." I felt Minho's hand on the small of my back, guiding me into the warmth of the SUV. As the door closed with a heavy, expensive thud, I looked out the tinted window one last time. Chris was still sitting there, clutching the 50-cent coin, as if it were the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. He was a ghost in a city that belonged to the woman he had tried to break. The motorcade pulled away, merging into the stream of lights. I leaned my head back against the leather seat and closed my eyes. The final karma wasn't that he was poor or that I was rich. It was that I no longer felt anything for him at all. No hate, no anger, no fear. He was just a stranger with a coin, and I was a woman with a life that he could no longer touch. Minho took my hand, his thumb tracing the ring he had placed there years ago. "Is it finished?" he asked softly. "It's finished," I replied. The bet was settled. The debt was paid. And as we drove into the night toward the home we had built together, I finally let the memory of the cafeteria, the mop, and the quiet girl fade into the darkness where they belonged. I was Jasmine Lewis Kim, and I was finally beautifully free. Jasmine traded her mop for a throne, proving that your past doesn't define your future. If you loved seeing Chris get exactly what he deserved, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of ultimate karma. Because in a world of bets and cowards, real power is the strength to survive, and a love that protects at all costs.